In this video, I'll be running through the theoretical application of how to make more money when you're discounting. So how do we actually make more contribution dollars rather than less when we run a 20% off or a 30% off store-wide sale? This is strictly applying to those wide percentage off periods, which is usually your end of financial year and your Black Friday sale when you're going to do some kind of site-wide 20% or site-wide 30, 40, 50, 60% off sale. What should end up happening is that if you put discount rate on the y-axis, and so as we go to the right, let's say that this peaks out at 50%, and so all the way over here, we're discounting all products by 50%, and then all the way over here, we have 0%, and then we're sitting somewhere in the middle. What we ideally want to see is that as we increase our discount rate, our average order value increases. And the reason why we want to see that is because when people are given an opportunity to save more, they generally will spend more because they want to capitalize on that sale. Now, life isn't perfect, and in application, this actually isn't what it ends up looking like. It ends up looking something like this, where you'll get bumps at specific percentage discounts when it makes sense. Now, average order value in isolation here actually doesn't really matter. And so we need to make a clone of this, because we're talking about making more profit. We're not talking about just making more arbitrary revenue dollars. And so we need to make a second version, and we'll pull over here. And we need to switch this over. So we're not going to call this average order value anymore. And we're instead going to call it GP, gross profit on first purchase. Now, in a moment, we'll also go to contribution profit, but let's start here. Now, when we're looking at GP, the issue is that we're actually fighting margin erosion as we move to the right on the axis. And so as we start to discount more, we are losing more margin, and therefore we are actually fighting an increase in gross profit. And so this chart doesn't look like this. What will end up happening here is that because average order value stays flat for this first increase in discounting, you're actually seeing a decline in gross profit at a unit level. And then when there's suddenly a spike, we see this spike also represent itself in GP, and then it likely comes back down. Now, it's worth considering here that this is not percentage figures. So you might be thinking, okay, even though we're moving to the right, as a nominal dollar value, we are improving. You're not. We're looking at dollar values here on the y-axis. And so in this particular instance, what you start to discover, and this is the first post I ever made on LinkedIn that actually went viral and got like hundreds of shares and hundreds of comments, was the fact that brands have this optimal point of discount rate. And so if you can find this point right here, well, we want to actually discount by this amount because this is where we make the most money. When we discount further than this, yes, we might do more volume, but the actual nominal dollar value of gross profit declines. And so it's all well and good doing more revenue, but your actual GP that you end up with at the end of the day, or your contribution dollars, is less. And so it makes no sense. You may as well do less volume and maximize profitability. And this obviously becomes more and more the case as you shift further and further to the right, because you start to decline profits precipitously. And so you see this squeeze occur when you try to plot target ROAS against a discounting curve. And so here you can see this is pretty much exactly what we were plotting, except on the y-axis instead we have break-even ROAS and target ROAS rather than GP, just another way to represent the exact same thing. And what you'll see there is that as you start to approach 40 to 50% discounting, target ROAS goes exponential. And it's because the amount of margin remaining goes exponentially to zero. And so you need to start operating at crazy efficiencies to be able to even hit your profit targets at a unit level. And so then where this becomes even more interesting, and ultimately at the end of this, you should have a bit of an idea how to apply this to your brand and then actually make more money during these periods, is that, and let's just do a clone, we can then go and look at contribution margin. And so on the y-axis, we're now changing this to CM. And CM3. For those that don't know what CM3 is, it's your gross profit minus your ad spend. And so now we're taking into consideration CAC. And the reason why CAC is important is because if you go and discount by 50%, you're going to have a wildly better cost to acquire a customer than you are if you're discounting by 5%. Okay, the difference in demand there is going to be extreme just due to the value driven by the offer. The offer is just considerably better. And so because of that, as we move to the right, your cost to acquire a customer actually improves, and therefore you should see more profit. And so this graph changes again. And so what it will actually look like is here we will have, and I've just moved it over here, and so here we will actually have the highest CAC. And so we're actually not going to have much margin here. We're actually going to lose a lot in terms of dollars. And then as we start to move to the right, we're actually going to see this graph increase substantially relevant to the discount, because our CAC's going to drop as we move. And so now this in itself is a little bit confusing. And so what I want to do is consolidate all of the graphs into one. And so let's take all of these lines. The y-axis now represents just dollar figures, and then the lines represent the actual amount. And then we can go and take all of them and we can put them onto this final graph. And this is then what we end up with. And so as we increase our discounting rate, our average order value increases. People buy more when we discount more heavily because they want to capture the offer and the ability for them to spend more. Now, gross profit, as we increase our discounting, gets worse because we're giving away more of the margin that we have. And so once we add that dynamic in, what we end up seeing is a curve that looks something like this. Now, obviously, this is theoretical. These curves change in dynamics as you change the business and the product portfolio and the reasons as to why people might increase in threshold, etc. But this gives you an idea. And then when we come down to contribution margin, well, the dynamic here is that as we increase the discount rate, we actually see better CAC. And so we pay less on marketing. And so that's when we actually see an expansion here. We see it go up as you increase the discount rate. And so then as you look across all of these offers, ultimately you want to be choosing the correct optimization point for the sale. And so what most people will do is they'll go, well, when we actually discount really heavily at 40%, we see our average order value goes up. And so let's discount at 40%. Without consideration of the impact on GP, and then ultimately how that trails down into the cost to acquire a customer and the profit that is left at the end of the order. And so ideally, you want to be able to understand and know and have data points on what is your average order value lift when you do X percentage or when you do a particular offer. What does your GP end up going to when you actually do that offer? And what is your GP across these different average order value thresholds? Now that is something that you can calculate very easily right now. You don't need any historical data. You just layer in discount rates and you calculate what your GP is going to end up being. And then for contribution margin, once again, you want to reference into historical data here and look at, well, when we run this particular offer, what does our CAC sit at on average when we run that offer in a particular campaign? And then from there, you can start to build an understanding of where your optimal offer begins sitting to be able to maximize profit. And so we did this in a very rudimentary way about 1.5 years ago, which is when we built this margin discount model. Now, if you want this model, reach out, I'll give it to you. It's not very good. There's a much better way to do this, which is what inspired this video. But the premise of this model is correct, and it really gets the point across well, which is that as you increase your discount rate here, as you move down this column, your average order value will increase. Now, how do you know if your average order value is increasing or not? Well, it's based on your average unit retail and your units per transaction. Okay, average order value is average unit retail times units per transaction times 1 minus discount rate times 1 minus return rate plus shipping collected. Now, for the sake of this model, we didn't put shipping collected in here, which is a bit silly. And return rates weren't included, which is kind of fair enough. We don't really need to consider return rates in a model like this. It's not the point of it. And so with that being said, then as you go and increase, you can start to map, well, how many additional units do we need customers to be putting in their cart to be able to offset the discount? And then we can obviously do a COGS calculation based on unit economics, and we can get an idea of how GP is changing as things increase here. Now we actually don't have a GP column, but we can just add it in and we can go and look at how GP changes across these discounts. And what you'll end up noticing here is that GP increases and decreases depending on the threshold. And so you start at $36, it declines. And so running a 10% off discount for this business is actually a bad idea. They make less money. You may as well just run full price. But then as they go up to a 20% discount, there's a massive jump in GP, and then it declines again, and it never goes back to this amount. And so for this particular brand, their optimal discount rate seems to be 20%, because that's where they get the biggest jump in units per transaction. Now, the way to make a better version of this model is to be able to just pull historical data out from a Shopify store and be able to identify what the actual units per transaction are during discounting periods. The reason why that is so hard, and I haven't made the calculator yet and I'm not giving it away in this video, is because most discounting is done through direct markdowns within Shopify. And so you're taking the price and physically adjusting it down, which does not get logged anywhere or recorded as a discount rate or a discount that you can extract out of the SQL data. And so with that being said, what that means is that you have to somewhat approach this like you would with an MMM, where you have to go back and tag up all historical discount periods and pull the data individually. And so it's a very manual process that takes a lot of time, but it's something that's worth doing because it's important to get an understanding of the dynamics of your unit economics as you change discounting factors so that you can start to determine where that optimal point is. This is also really good for just KPI and benchmarking moving into a sales period. And so if you're going to move into, and this is pretty topical because we have end of financial year coming up in 2 months, and so people are going to start planning for that sale right about now. You want to be thinking that, okay, we're just going to do a 20% off discount. That's the decision. We've put that in stone. But for us to actually make money on this, what do we need our units per transaction or our average order value to jump to? Well, we needed to jump to at least a 1.5 for us to make money. Okay, well, how do we structure our offers? How do we structure our landing pages? How do we structure our upsells and our cross sells and our flows to really ensure that we can hit that UPT on this discounting period to make sure that we make the most amount of gross profit possible? Now, in conjunction to that, well, what does our CAC have to be? Well, normally our CAC target's $20, but here we're actually going to have slightly higher GP, at least expected, if we can hit these units per transaction numbers. And so we can actually afford our CAC to go $1 to $2 higher. And so we can be a little bit more aggressive during this period, and we can actually likely change our spend forecast accordingly. And so you're going from your actual offer, you're then moving into the GP level in terms of expectations around gross profit of that offer. And then that's backing you into the math of how much can we spend to go and acquire customers, and how aggressive, therefore, can we go on demand generation through paid media platforms. And so it's that stepstoning through these 3 graphs, essentially, that allow you to determine how you can make the most amount of money possible out of a discount period.